Hi, this is Lisa, and you are listening to I Love That Movie. This podcast is for movie lovers. It's not an unbiased opinion, it's not a straightforward review, it's just a couple people talking about a movie that they love. The format is each week I have a guest, and that guest and I discuss a movie that they love, something they're obsessed with, something they connect with. We'll talk about the plot, the director, and the actors, but we'll also talk about the personal connection my guest has with that movie. So if that sounds like something you want to listen to, keep listening. Hey, this is Lisa, and if you want to catch up with me on Twitter, you can find me at ILTM Podcast. I'm also on Instagram at I Love That Movie Podcast, and we have a Patreon. The show is always free, but if you want to support us on there, you can. Right now, we're covering She-Hulk, and we also cover, other movies that I'm watching. A lot of people ask me for opinions on movies and shows that I'm watching, so I put all that on the Patreon. And I want to take a moment to thank my top patrons. They are Chris Balga, Jeff Widman, Philip Barker, Michael Cross, and Josh Johnson. Thank you guys so much for keeping the lights on. And if you like what you hear today, please subscribe and rate the show. It does help new listeners find us. Well, we've got a familiar voice on the podcast. I've got Cody from Video Store Rejects.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to come on. I know I kind of bullied myself to come back on the show, but
That is not true.
it's my,
We'll always love having you on.
it's my favorite time of the year. And I know last year you posted like who wanted to come on and discuss a Christmas movie. And then I know like you either had too many people that wanted to come on or scheduling and stuff. And so I was like, I'm going to try and get myself on for spooky season this year because I always want to talk a spooky movie, especially when it's October.
I totally get that. And yeah, I've been getting a lot of requests. I know I'm going to run out of weeks, but I'm trying to make sure that everybody gets a chance. And so I appreciate your tenacity. Thank you so much for reaching out. And if people haven't heard your episodes on the podcast before, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Oh, sure. I'm Cody House. I have a show called Video Store Rejects. We do director filmographies and we kind of do a weekly sideshow where we discuss themes. Like right now, we're doing spooky movies. We just did Nightmare on Elm Street and
Nice.
Hellraiser, the original Hellraiser. I haven't seen the new one yet.
I haven't either. Yeah.
And we're doing Season of the Witch and Dream Warriors next week. And you've had me on the show twice. I think you managed to keep me under an hour of talking about RoboCop. So hats off to you for that because I don't know how you did that. And then we talked Life of Brian for Easter.
That's right. And also I've been on your show a couple times too. So
Yes, you have. You've
yeah.
done Princess Mononoke, Titanic, E.T., and Wrath of Khan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did the Titanic one come out? I feel like I missed that one. I need to go
No,
look at
that was when
those.
we were still doing audio only, and that's somewhere in the editing room somewhere. I'm sorry.
I hope someday it sees the light of day only because I feel like there were some good jokes made, but
Yeah, we had a good
it was kind of
time.
tedious to edit though because I feel like that was a long one because it's a long movie.
Well, it was shorter than our Aliens episode we recorded.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh. Well, my guest always picks the movie. Obviously, I've teased that it is spooky season, so it will be a spooky movie. But what movie did you choose to talk about today?
I chose Wes Craven's foundational, or at least it's foundational for me, horror film, Scream.
Now, can I admit to you, you're like, oh, you must have loved it because you picked this one. You gave me like a couple options, and I said, let's do this one. Truth be told, this may be the first time I've ever sat down and seriously watched it all the way through. Like it's been on. I
Uh
didn't see it
huh.
in theaters when it came out. It's been on TV. I've like, kind of sat down and watched it when it's on, but I think this was like the first time I gave it my undivided attention actually.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's wild because I just listened to a podcast about this the other day. It's called The Faculty of Horror. They're two Canadian professors. They're women, and they talked about like how, this was a foundational film for especially millennials. Like, I know it's considered like a Gen X horror film because of the age of everyone in the movie, and it's the late 90s and written by Kevin Williamson, but I really feel like this was like for our generation, this was like a touchstone for like either getting us into horror movies or like one of the ones where like, oh yeah, that's one of our favorites. And apparently it's a very popular with women, millennial women, because I guess there's a lot of older male horror fans that are in the Gen X or older crowd that may have grew up in the 70s and 80s that kind of pushed this to the side or gatekeeping. And we can talk about maybe why that
Interesting.
is. Why that is, because that was shocking to me too, because I knew this was like a well-reviewed movie for a horror film when it came out, and I thought everyone liked this movie. But I guess maybe they don't consider it like, top tier horror films. But I mean, it did kind of resurrect horror movies for the 90s.
I completely agree with you. I will say that I was in full brat mode when this came out. 1996. I was probably like 13 or 14, and I was very counterculture at that time. And a lot of the stars in this movie were very popular. I mean, this is like, like you said, it's like the 90s, but I do agree that it is a millennial movie. And all my sorry, junior high at the time, like friends loved these actors, and I kind of was like, "Oh," like I always acted like I was like older, wiser, somehow better. And so I feel like that got in the way of me enjoying this. And remember this, I think this came out, is it when like the American Pie movies and stuff like that
This
came out
is
too?
a few years before American
Okay,
Pie.
okay. Well, there was like a good chunk of time where I was like, movies these days and what the kids are into, it sucks. Which is very, I think, teenagery to do,
Uh-huh.
but especially when you kinda don't fit in, it's sort of your go-to, I think, defense mechanism, so,
Yeah.
I think that's why I didn't give this a chance, and then I also don't really love slasher movies, which I
Mhm.
think this movie is kind of a takedown on the slasher genre, which is kinda cool and refreshing, but I think because I tend to like stuff that is supernatural, that's what truly scares me, um, more than realistic horror for some reason. And so I gravitate towards that, and I also I don't know, I don't get a huge kick out of usually seeing people stabbed, specifically by, like, a serial killer. So, I think that's why I kinda stayed away from this movie for so long, but I think I've in recent years been sort of re-examining that entire genre of horror and viewing it under a new lens and thinking about it differently. So I thought this was like the perfect time to go back and watch this movie again.
Yeah, I think it is kind of a takedown. Like, it is often considered a satire, but I think it's also like a love letter to those movies, but at the
For
same
sure.
time pointing out like the ridiculousness of those movies. So what I like about this movie, besides that it's, all about being obsessed with movies and talking about movies,
Yeah.
is that it kind of points out like what's ridiculous about the slasher genre. And like in this movie, the ghost faced killer, like it's more realistic. Like he falls down and people kick him and hit him and he runs into things, like, and he has to chase them literally. Like he's not this unstoppable killing machine walking at a steady pace coming after them. And you're
Yeah, I agree.
you're more with the victims and the characters that are potentially being threatened by Ghostface than you are. It's not like Jason or Michael Myers where you're watching through the killer's eyes.
Exactly. I think that's the biggest shift in the slasher genre. It's sort of almost in some ways like a dark, to me, a bit of a dark power fantasy where, the killer is just like larger than life, almost godlike killer that's just going around taking people out, making up his own rules, tormenting people and getting away with it. This movie, at the end of the day, it's a flesh and blood person. It's a team, which makes more sense, honestly, than just being one person anyway. And if they're wearing a mask, obviously, it could be more than one person. I mean, there's just a lot of stuff to dissect. It just makes more sense. And also, they're stupid, to be honest. Like,
Yeah.
by the end of the movie, you're like, oh, this is a dumb kid. And then I think in real life, it's closer to reality. There's been a lot of talk recently, and I'll try not to go on too much of a tangent, but a lot of people in the true crime genre don't like the fact that we sort of, lift up some pretty terrible names in history of people
Oh,
that
for
committed horrific
sure.
crimes. And we kind of almost put them on a pedestal and like, oh, they're evil
Mhm.
geniuses. But I feel like this movie's like, you don't have to be an evil genius to cause mayhem. It's
No.
just like at all. And I think more often than not, that's the case. They're not geniuses. And so like you said, I think it's sort of an homage to all horror. But it at the same time is a little bit of a critique on the genre as well. Like it's just doing a lot of different things that are interesting, and the movie brags basically about being different and subverting expectations, and it does that. But I think that could be what leads to the gatekeeping. I mean, if you're really in love with that genre and you're in love with its rules, and then a movie sort of shakes those rules up, I think that's going to lend itself to being a little bit controversial.
Well, and another thing it does, and let's be honest with a lot of the fans of these type of films, is they watch it for sex and violence, right? They want to see
Yeah.
boobies. And
Yeah,
this
true.
movie, even though it has a sex scene, you don't really see anything. Like they don't really show you anything that you normally get in a slasher movie that was in like those Friday the 13th movies.
Yeah, and I wanna say, like, I mean, I'm not, like, against it, those older horror films, I think they're good, they have their place, but one critique on them is that women, especially female victims, are usually almost like a lot of times when they get taken out, you don't even see their face, and there's a lot of nudity involved, and, like, they feel like it's a little bit dehumanizing, and so this movie, I think, goes against that. I mean, they talk about that in the movie, actually, but they don't end up doing that in this film. Like you said, there's a sex scene, and they talk about the rule in a lot of horror movies about how, like, if somebody loses their virginity, like, they're going down.
Yeah.
And, spoiler, like, that's not what happens in this movie. So, like, I think that could be why there's some controversy. Oh, before I go too much further, because we're already talking so much about the movie, if you haven't seen this movie before, we are gonna talk spoilers. So, maybe go see it first. You've had time, but, that you could rent it, come back and watch it. I actually rented
Or
it on
if you
iTunes.
have Paramount Plus or
Oh, is it
Showtime,
on there?
all 5 films are on there, so you
Well,
could watch
shoot,
the whole
I rented
franchise
it. But anyway,
if you have that
um,
service.
I do, and I didn't realize that, but that's okay. It happens. So the plot of this is that a year after the murder of the main character's mother, a teenage girl is terrorized by a new killer who targets her and her friends by using horror films as part of a deadly game. And this movie has kind of been parodied to death at this point.
Yeah,
But
interesting
go
sorry.
ahead. No, no, go for
Interesting,
it.
the parody of this movie, Scary Movie, was actually
Yes.
the original title of this before they changed it to Scream.
Really? Okay, that's a good segue into I wanted to share some quick facts. That's a great quick fact. Another one that I had was that Wes Craven nearly turned down the option to direct Scream because he
Yes.
thought the first scene with Drew Barrymore reminded him too vividly of the climax sequence of Last House on the Left, his first
Mhm.
movie.
Yeah, and also Wes Craven, even though we consider him one of the masters of horror, he
Mhm.
really hated that he was like pigeonholed to that genre for most of his career. Like
Oh, really?
he will say that his favorite film he directed was Music from the Heart because it's like the one time he got to make something that wasn't horror or horror eschewed, even though I would say he's at least made 4 or 5 foundational films in the genre. I know this and Nightmare on Elm Street are the two everyone says, but love him or hate him, his first two films, even though they're very exploitation-y, were groundbreaking films. And I'm even going to throw
Mhm.
in People Under the Stairs. Now, I'm glad that it's getting a remake with filmmakers of color to tell that story, but
Yeah.
in I can't remember if it came out late 80s, early 90s, but for him to do that at that time point and have that kind of statement in horror was very groundbreaking, even though it's not as popular as some of these other films in his resume.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, thank you for sharing that. I didn't realize that, but yeah, I mean, you think of him as like I mean, it's almost shocking to hear him say that he didn't like being pigeonholed for that because he made so many of them and did it so well, including doing groundbreaking and original things.
Well, I
The
would
other
even
thing Oh, go
go
ahead. Go
ahead.
ahead.
Oh,
Oh, no,
I
you're
keep
fine.
uh the how meta this movie is, he kind of already did it 2 years prior with New Nightmare as well. Like,
Mhm.
even though that wasn't as popular of a movie, which I guess people were just tired of Freddy Krueger at that point, even though it kind of was doing what people who didn't like the sequels were complaining about. Like, it made him scary again and like was a really a horror film,
Yeah.
even though it was a movie within a movie sort of thing going on in that one.
Oh, interesting. Maybe that just kind of set the foundation for this one. I love Nightmare on Elm Street, but I feel like that one also was a little bit. It's his stuff is kind of like it's good, but it's a little bit silly. Like there's humor to sort of break up
Well,
the scary parts,
comedy
which
and
is what
horror
I
are
like.
like the opposite sides of a coin.
Mhm.
They actually go well together. And like the setup for a joke is the same setup as a scare. So it makes sense like someone like Jordan Peele is so good at making horror films, even though he started
Hey.
in comedy, you know.
Yeah, that leads into my next fact. I was gonna say, just thinking about the new reboot of this, but Wes Craven directed 7 episodes of The Twilight Zone.
Which version?
I think in '86.
The 80s
Yeah,
because
yeah,
yeah, they've
yeah.
rebooted it like 3 times I think now.
But Jordan Peele rebooted it as well, so that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting. One weird thing too is that Wes Craven's never directed or written a screenplay for a Stephen King or written sorry, let me say that one more time. He's never directed a movie based on, like, a Stephen King novel,
That's
which is kind of
interesting.
weird. Mhm.
Yeah, because Carpenter did one, Cronenberg did one. I think that's the only 2 big horror guys that did one. Like, there's some other big name directors that
Yeah,
well
like Kubrick and
well,
yeah.
Flanagan's done 2, which he's kinda
Mhm.
and yeah, so that's kinda weird that Craven never did a King adaptation.
And it's not like you can say, like, "Oh, well, this is so dramatically different from something Stephen King would come up with," because it's not, like, neither one really, but, yeah, maybe he just along with that pigeonhole thing you were talking about, maybe he just chose, like, to stay away from that because it's so on the nose or I don't know, but interesting.
Mhm.
I guess leaning more into talking about Wes Craven, you already talked about some of his filmography with, Nightmare on Elm Street, Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes. Also a movie that my husband really likes, Deadly Friend.
I've never seen that, I've heard about that one. Is that the one with,
It's got like an evil robot.
yeah, I can't
It's
remember.
like fun. Like if you're
Is
gonna,
that Sharon
if you're gonna,
Stone is in that? Maybe?
I'm trying to
A young
remember. I
Sharon
We watched
Stone?
it like a couple years ago. I'm gonna look it
I
up
I
while
haven't
I
seen all
talk
of his
about it.
movies.
No,
I'm
I don't think
more of
it's
a
Sharon
I'm more
Stone.
of a Carpenter guy, but I'd need
Oh,
to see
well,
the rest
same.
of his
Yeah.
movies. But this is what got me into horror movies, really. I didn't
Really? Okay.
Yeah, so backstory of why I love this movie. When I was a little kid, I was a little scaredy cat, scared of everything. I didn't
I
want to watch
relate to
anything.
that.
I didn't want to watch anything spooky. Apparently, one year for Halloween, this guy came out of a coffin and I ran all the way back to our house because we were living in like a neighborhood where you could just walk around the block to.
You're like, I'm done. I'm good.
And I had seen spooky-ish movies. Like I know I had seen Jaws already. I had seen like Beetle the Beetlejuice, Critters, Gremlins, stuff like that. But I guess it had to be either humorous or sci-fi or monster skewed because I'm pretty sure I'd seen some of the Alien movies already. But the first Alien movie scared me. So, but
Well, I mean, it's kind of a horror movie. I mean,
it was totally as a horror movie, but I
yeah.
don't know. I guess in my rational brain, I was like, "Oh, well, and that can't happen in real life or something." But it wasn't, I guess, spooky enough to. I don't know, but also I was scared, but I was also intrigued by the horror section. Like there were certain like videos I'd want to just stare at, like the Thing VHS cover or some other things, but I didn't ever like get ballsy enough to rent one. I would just look at it and then like, no, I can't do it. I can't do it. And I used to be deathly afraid of Freddy Krueger, even though I hadn't seen all the movies. I just the look, and
Oh yeah, I was scared of
yeah.
him too. I was scared of Child's Play. I had
Hmm.
horrible nightmares about dummies like forever. Like I have a terrifying nightmare that I still remember every detail of to this day. Like I was a big scaredy cat too. I get it.
Yeah, I saw that way too young, and it scared me as well. So I just made it to the point where I was like, okay, I'm just not a horror movie person. I don't like scary movies. Like the Sleepy Hollow cartoon scared me. Like it
It
was
is kind of
spooky.
scary.
The
I mean,
Fantasia,
when you see that headless guy, it's like, I mean, I guess as an adult, you're like, oh, I'm used to that story now. Da da da. It's like almost like a fairy tale, but I mean, a headless horseman is scary.
the bald mountain scene in Fantasia scared me. Like I was just a big scaredy cat. But anyways, yeah, I'm junior high age at the time this comes out. I didn't see this in theaters because one, I didn't want to because it was a scary movie, and two, I was far too young. I don't think they would have taken me to see it, but I was seeing action movies already at this age. But I don't know. People have a weird thing about which type of violence is okay to watch and which isn't. But anyways,
True, true, true. Including myself. I'll call myself out too.
I my best
We all
friend at
have
the
our rules.
yeah, my best friend at the time is like summer vacation. I guess it's at the video store, and he's staying the night, and he's like, "We should rent Scream." I'm like, "It's a scary movie. I don't want to watch it." He's like, "Come on, give it a chance. It's it should be good." And I guess suckered myself into peer pressure or whatever. I don't know how he talked me into it, but I was like, "Fine, we'll watch it," and I loved it. And after I got done watching Scream, I went out and rented Halloween and Friday the 13th. And that's
Wow.
so it hooked me. I was like, okay, I like scary movies. And I think this is a good segue to get someone into scary movies because it's scary enough that it's not like making fun or it's not spooky at all, but it's
Yeah.
not too scary to where like you just traumatized me for the rest of my life. You know, it's a
Yeah, I
nice
agree.
it's a nice in between type of movie because of that humor, because of that meta self-referential dialogue and everything in the movie. It kind of welcomes you into a horror movie.
I agree. I think, for me, like it doesn't really scare me. I think everyone has what scares them, and it's different for everybody. And so for me, like the slasher genre isn't, I mean, in real life, obviously I'd be afraid of somebody breaking and entering and stuff, but in the context of a movie, it's not usually what makes me super afraid. And I think even if it is something that's scary typically to you, I think this movie does a good job of sort of skating the line. Like you said, it's more kind of in the mid range of what's scary. So I do think it's a good introduction for sure. Do you want to talk a little bit about the cast next?
Yeah, so let's go ahead and first off, great opening to a movie, even if it is a little similar to Last House on the Left, but they pull a psycho on us, right? Like
Yep.
probably the only name. Well, people probably knew who Courtney Cox was because Friends
Oh,
was
yeah.
on TV show by then. But of all the other actors that are playing teens, nobody knew who anybody was but Drew Barrymore. Really, you know.
Yes. And she's looking so wholesome and sweet and beautiful, and then she's murdered right away. And
Yeah.
you're
So
just
that,
not expecting it.
and then you're like, well, who's the person this movie's about? They just killed the movie star.
Yeah. And I will say, like, right away, and maybe I can get some of your thoughts on this. But okay, so Drew Barrymore is murdered, and we know she's playing, she's forced to play a game, a movie game with the killer.
Mm-hmm.
And then it kind of cuts to, the next day at school. And we know that Nev Campbell's character, Sydney, um, man, see, I wanna talk about this movie so bad, I'm, like, jumping ahead of everything I said we
That's
would do.
fine.
Let's
It's
just do
the
that. We'll talk about the actors as they come up.
Yeah,
New
that's just
rules,
the
new
nature
rules.
of podcasting. You don't have to
It
go in
is.
order.
Thank you, thank you. But I noticed that, like, at school, people right away are or kids right away, are making not light of well, they do later make light of the deaths, but I noticed they're not that broken up. Like, their class member was killed, nobody is crying in this classroom. Did you notice that?
Yeah, that is interesting. And, like, I know that we are much more self aware about people's mental health when something traumatic happens now than we were. But still, you would think, like, because this looks like it's small town USA, right? Like, two teenagers were brutally murdered the night before. You think people would be a little more freaked out. Like, maybe not crying. And, like, it doesn't seem like she was that close to the main group of characters we're following, but they knew her because it's a small school, right? So you would think somebody would be upset or.
Yeah, like, she didn't have any friends or what's going on? Because like, nobody but, like, there is a vibe to this school, and I guess maybe it just kinda lends to the hyper reality of the movie, or I didn't know if it was supposed to be a commentary on the '90s, I don't know, but I noticed that people were, like, unusually cruel, like, the way that Sydney so we find out that, like, Sydney's mother was killed and sexually assaulted, we'll say at this
Mhm.
stage in the movie, they think she was sexually assaulted and murdered. And people, like, mercilessly tease Sydney about this, and also when Drew Barrymore is killed and, like, gutted, as they say, the kids are very callous about it, and some of that makes
Mhm.
sense later, like, we find out why some of the kids are so shitty, but, but, like, overall, I think just in general, like, the atmosphere of, like, making jokes and dressing like the killer and stuff like that, you're like, "Man, these kids really, have no boundaries."
Right?
Like, they're not sensitive at all, and, like, nobody seems to be really.
Well, the Fonz is pretty sensitive to everything.
He is, but I think he's also a red herring. Would you agree that, like, at one point in the movie, they almost want you to think he might have been the one that did it?
Maybe, but I think the whole reason he ends up getting killed is to throw off the investigation, you know?
That's true, but I mean, for the audience, like, there's that part where he, like, threatens those 2 teenagers, and
Oh, that's true. He does seem very
"I could gut
convincing.
you," and I was like, "I don't think a principal should, like, tell students that he's thinking about cutting them up."
Yeah, that's a little far, even though, like, they deserve to be berated for what they did,
For sure, what
but
they did
not
was
to the
awful,
point
or,
of
like,
our
re-traumatizing.
physical harm and possible murder.
I'm like, "They are children." I mean, they look 25 years old, but
Well, yeah, most of this cast was well past teenage years, but, that's the
yeah,
nature of Hollywood. Because
it is, it is.
children, you can't work minors on a 12-hour shift, and the subject and nature of sometimes what these films involve, better to have adults.
For sure. And like, so Sydney, ends up getting questioned about this. We kind of meet the little cast of characters, David Arquette as Deputy Dewey, who is also the brother of Rose McGowan's character, which I forgot she was in this.
Yeah, everybody tends to forget because I guess she's only in the first one, but she's really good in this. And
So, yeah.
I like her as the best friend, and she's got probably the most memorable death in the movie to me.
Oh yeah, it's pretty original. That garage really should have had a safety on it for when someone's trapped in the dog door, but yeah, she has like the most memorable death, and she looks beautiful and very striking with that hair. Like I was like, whoa, she kind of, I don't know, she really stands out to me in this movie. Also Skeet Ulrich as Billy.
AKA low rent Johnny Depp.
Yeah. Yeah, you can't help but wondering, like, was Wes Craven like, "I should have just casted Johnny Depp again, and I couldn't get
Well,
him,"
he'd have
or
been too old at that point, but
that's true. Um, but Billy, who is, I'm just gonna say it, dude's a horrible boyfriend right off the bat.
oh, totally a horrible boyfriend. In fact, they talked about this on the podcast I mentioned. They talked about this because Skeet Ulrich was also in The Craft same year. So was Nev Campbell.
Oh, that's right.
But he's playing kind of similar guys. He kind of, and like a woman, I forget, they wrote about this. Like his character is the very definition of what people should watch out for because he comes off as, oh, he's this cute, charming guy, but really he revolts to like manipulation and passive aggressiveness and, physical violence and trying to get girls to have sex with him,
Yeah, I feel like
really.
in the 90s, they were, like, really examining that type of guy. Like, I'm thinking of My So-Called Life. And, Jared Leto's character was kinda like this a little bit
Oh,
too, like, I mean,
shocker.
he was yeah, maybe in real life, I don't know, but he wasn't like a murderer or anything, but on the show, he's like a very, handsome, kinda troubled, teenage boy, but he kind of is a bad guy, like, he cheats on the main character, he's a little bit manipulative. And it's kind of like the guy that your parents warn you about kind of thing where it's like, okay, this guy at school's handsome, but like he's going to grow up to probably be not such a great person. And I feel like in the 90s and early 2000s they were kind of examining, like, instead of like I guess giving this guy an out all the time, like maybe we examine who this person is, this archetype, and so I think maybe that's why, casting sort of like a handsome dude, but like you said, like he's able to get away with things because he's charming, but underneath that, he's got some pretty obvious flaws. Like
Lots of
I
red
didn't,
flags.
yeah, like I didn't realize the first time I saw this that he was going to end up being the killer or one of them,
Oh
because they
yeah,
kind of do that back and forth dance. But really, like when he's pressuring her to have sex with him, when he and involves the death of her mom? As
right.
that has
Like
somehow that has something to do with it, and then he's like, "You need to get over that, and plus she was a slut," and, like, you're like, "Oh my god." I was like, "Oh, maybe, it's the '90s, I guess that was okay then?" And then it's like, "Oh, no, he's the killer, that's why."
it wasn't okay then. It's not okay now. That's part
No.
of like this horrible double standard that's a huge issue with men and women. Like we throw that word around when anytime a woman is promiscuous or enjoys sex, but we don't say that about a man when he does similar behavior. And truth be told about his character, that's really more what these toxic predatorial men are. Like we want to think they're all these evil people lurking in the shadows that snatch someone out of a corner, but really it's that charming manipulative person who tells you they're a nice person but really they're not.
Yeah, and it's also about opportunity and, proximity and all that stuff has a big part in it. We you would like to think, like you said, that it's a stranger, but it's probably gonna be somebody that they know. Um, I think
Yeah.
there's even like a big, a good monologue about, oh, I don't have a motive, and like that's even more interesting when we don't have a motive. And then it's like there's sort of the killers try to make themselves out in this film to be so interesting and so above having a motive, but at the end of the day, they just have their basic motives that killers would have, you know, like,
Yeah,
I
they
think that's
just
an interesting part of the movie too.
it's also, oh, we can do this because we want to, and we'll get away with it, and we'll make up this story, blah blah blah. Yeah, no,
No,
they're not
but
interesting.
yeah. Yeah, they don't have fascinating backstories, they're not deeply mysterious, they're just two people at their high school actually, in the end. Um, but yeah, no, I think like you said, the first opening scene is great, and then our introduction to our cast of characters is really good too. And then, there's gonna be a few more kills, before we get to find out more about our killers. Are there any other scenes in between that you kind of want to touch on that
Well,
stand out to you?
I think Jamie Kennedy kind of comes off as annoying now, but 11, 12-year-old 11
Yeah.
and 12-year-old Cody kind of identified with him a little bit because I was very movie obsessed, not horror movie obsessed, but that felt like the person I could relate to in the movie. But now I'm like, oh, that he he kind of comes off grating like a Tarantino or something, which maybe that's who they were sort of modeling the character after.
Yeah, maybe so. But I also feel like he's to throw you off just a little bit too, because
True, because like
yeah,
people would think, oh, he's the killer because he knows all
he's
these
weird.
movies
Yeah.
and he's obsessed with them, and which
I yeah.
which as this franchise goes along, like that's legacized with his character, especially with the new one.
Okay, I need to see the new one.
It's actually pretty good. Actually,
I've heard
all these
that.
movies are decent. Like for a horror franchise, these are all none of the sequels are as good as this one, but they are all watchable, entertaining movies that all have a little something interesting to say.
That's good. Yeah, I thought in the movie, like, when I alluded to earlier that, like, all the teens are being callous and they're being jerks. Some of that is because our cast of killers is within this group, and in order to not make that too obvious, we have to kind of make everybody a jerk. So I think that's part of why Jamie Kennedy's character kind of comes off as a little bit thoughtless and doofy and, like, rude. um but also, yeah, he represents the horror movie fan, or movie fan in
Right,
general.
he's
He
the
looks at the
fandom,
video
which
stores.
that
Yeah,
can, as we know in all fandoms, that can be a grating, annoying person sometimes, especially if what they thought was it supposed to be wasn't the way it was supposed to be. And it's like, well, maybe you should just watch the movie for what it is. And if you don't like it, fine. But, someone else likes it.
that's true. But I also think, like, it's interesting now because this movie has become somewhat of a time capsule, right? Because the fashion in the movie stars that are picked, and then this video store scene. I mean, this makes it.
Well,
Well, yeah.
al-
I mean,
also
we
the
don't have video
phones,
stores
and that it's
anymore.
going to take them a while to get the phone records. It's like, can't you just
Why do you
look?
have a cell phone? He's like,
Can't you just
everyone
grab the
does these
phone and look
days.
and see who he called and like her the internet when she calls 911? Like, yeah, it's very 90s.
Yeah. What's your emergency? She's like, "Ugh, I gotta type all that. Yeah, it's um very, very 90s. But yeah, no, I could see how, like, a young person seeing basically the nerd character in this, relating to that. I definitely would have related to that as well. So totally
Well,
get it.
and I could see, like, even though this movie's dated, I could see younger people watching it, especially younger people that are kind of enrooted in fandom,
Yes.
kind of being like, "Oh, yeah, this movie is exactly like commenting on that sort of thing and those people."
Yep, yep.
I think we need to talk about Courtney Cox in this movie
Okay.
because I think she's very good. And I think
She
it's
is.
interesting that normally, because she's playing like a sleazy tabloid like reporter, like back in the day it was like what hard copy and like maybe a TMZ like type of reporter.
Yeah, and also maybe just a little bit of a critique of the media in general. Like, I was watching a pretty heartbreaking TikTok from to get a little bit serious, but I won't stay on this too long. But it was a former victim of Columbine, and like
Mm,
the media, the way the media sort of hounded them. You know,
mm-hmm.
they had just witnessed this horrible event, and they're obviously traumatized, and yet a camera is thrown in their face right away, and they're questioned. You know, these poor victims are so young. They were minors, and like a
Mm-hmm.
camera is thrown in their face immediately, asking for details, asking for their takes, and da da da. And I think Courtney Cox she kind of represents those types of reporters that like only care about the story, only care about the headline and the reaction. There's even a part where either she or one of the other reporters tells the main character, like, you owe us, you know, you owe the people an explanation, and like really outrageous treatment of a minor who experienced multiple tragedies, you know.
Right.
So I wonder if some of it is a little bit of a commentary on that.
I think it is, but we know if this movie was made today, she'd be a podcaster.
Oh,
And
yeah. A podcaster with a true crime podcast for sure.
yep. But it's
Mhm.
interesting that even though she's playing like a representation of like that type of media at that time, because you know this is post OJ trial and around the time the John Benet Ramsey case, um, she's actually right in her book. Like she wrote a book about it, right? Like she's actually like she was actually right. Like you know
Yeah,
her,
I think yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
even though
You
she's
sound like you had a thought.
insensitive and just cares about the story, she actually got it right, and like she's trying to get to the bottom of it.
That's
And
true. I think they kind of start portraying her a certain way, and then it's the more you get to know the character, it's sort of flipped around. Um,
well, we also, and I don't know if this was in the script naturally that her and David Arquette's character were going to kind of hook up, or they just had chemistry, like the just natural life chemistry, because they ended up being married for a long time and they
that's true.
developed that into the script. But you know, it's kind of sweet in this
It
movie.
is. And it's more age appropriate for Dewey, who, you know, you can tell that he has feelings. It makes sense. He's young, you know. I don't think the age gap is huge, but he has feelings for his sister's friend a little bit. But I think, you know, him moving on to the reporter makes a little more sense because at least they're both adults. I
Uh
think
huh.
Courtney Cox is like older than him, or at least she's playing older than him. But
She is older than him in real life, and I think she's supposed
wow.
to be playing older than him because she makes that comment like, I'm popular with young men between this age and this age.
Oh, I forgot about that. And she probably really was because of Friends.
Oh
But,
yeah, in real life too.
yeah,
Yeah, probably.
yeah. But yeah, I think, another cool thing about her and the main character too is, like, you know, they have a lot of confrontations and fights in the film where she calls her, you know, the B word and stuff, but
Hmm.
ultimately they, um, go to bat for each other at the climax, and I think that's another subverting expectations, like, instead of having them be in this, like, sort of petty cat fight, they actually strengthen their relationship, and, you know, Courtney Cox saves the day at the end. And Nev Campbell's character is sort of, you're right, she doesn't see like the truth. She's really stuck on this idea for a long part of the movie that her mother is quote unquote innocent.
Hmm.
In the sense that one theory that Gail had was that, you know, her mother was having an affair and that could have been why the killer killed her. And
Which that's
Sydney, yeah, doesn't want to accept this, and it's interesting, right? Because she's preventing her mother from getting real justice because of the perception is worse than the crime, which it
hmm
shouldn't be. That's pretty sexist, you know, like that's
right.
terrible.
Well,
um
that damn
yeah.
patriarchy, you know,
Yeah,
putting
and she internalizes that. There's a point where she's like, I'm worried I'll turn out like my mother, and then her boyfriend's like, yeah, it makes sense, you know, you're worried you'll become a slut, and you're like, what? Like
God.
that's
Oh,
crazy. Like, what's going on? And then later you find out, okay, because he's a killer, and he killed her for that
yeah.
reason.
And
Yeah.
I love how like yeah, she's playing the final girl and that's part of the trope of these movies, but like she subverts it by like playing them at their own game.
Yes, that's the best part. And it kind of makes sense too because I think, her character had this tragedy she went through, and I think because he's back out to get her again, she's a lot bolder. Like almost like I'm like that kind of mentally prepared her for this part. Whereas the other characters, I think, like Drew Barrymore and some of the other characters that get killed are more caught off guard. She's like ready to fight because she knows something happened to her mom and that someone did it. So I think she's always secretly kind of bracing herself for that. And she's also like, at school she's not well liked and people are bullying her, and so it's
Well,
sort of toughened her up for the end, I
yeah,
think.
we get that scene in the bathroom with these random characters we never see again, just like eviscerating her for no reason.
Yeah, just mean girl stuff, and then again the slut thing comes up again.
Hmm.
Yeah. So
But
interesting
I love
take
that
on that.
by the end of the movie, like after she stabs him and kills Matthew Lillard, and they're like, "Oh well, this is the scene where the killer comes back," and she just shoots him in the head. She's like, "Not in my movie."
Yes, yeah.
Which that's always what happens. So it's like, yeah, let me shoot him in the head. He can't come back from that. And that's what's interesting about the sequels is it's always a different killer. Like they don't come back.
Yeah, yeah,
They're
it's not
dead.
like
Even though there were
Freddy or Jason.
theories in part 3 and then even with the newest one that they were going to somehow bring Matthew Lillard's character back. I don't know how you survive that death though.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, Matthew Lillard was such a like staple in a lot of especially movies aimed at teens at this time.
Yeah, even though
He
he's
was in
like
everything.
30.
Yeah, I think he's like visually obviously 30, but but he was
Cuz
just so well liked. I think people just wanted
I
him in
think
everything.
he's like one of the older people in the movie. I think he might even be older than David Arquette, which is kind of funny.
Yeah, he just sort of plays off that goofiness, I think, and that's how he gets away with it.
Well, I mean that one scene after like they reveal their plan and they're stabbing themselves to look like they like survived. They're just the survivors of the killing, and like when Sydney one ups them and he's on the phone, he's like, "My parents are gonna be so mad at me," because it's like really they're just spoiled, rotten brats who thought they could get
Yeah.
away with something and didn't realize there's consequences to these type of actions and not caring or valuing human life.
Yeah. And Skeet Ulrich's character, he was mad that he feels abandoned because her mother had slept with his dad, and instead of blaming his dad he blames her mother for some reason, and
Yeah,
so
like
that
your
was his
dad had an affair.
justification.
Why aren't you mad at your dad?
Yeah, he's convenient. And like the whole movie too, like we're kind of wondering if Nev Campbell's dad maybe did it, right? Because
Yeah, that's the whole red herring because like he's disappeared. They can't find him. And like, if she had an affair, like that's a total motive.
Mhm. It's the husband that people always, that's the first suspect,
Uh,
right? A significant other.
Always. And
Yeah.
speaking of like the nature of true crime, I just did a David Fincher ranking. Really, Gone Girl's a really good like expose of that true crime obsession that people have.
Mm. Yeah, I think lately we're sort of examining that and like, is it possible? I think it is to be interested in that genre in some way that's not so destructive and exploitative. Um,
Right.
I think
And
there
like
are ways to do that, and it starts probably with making sure that the victims' families are on board and that the motive be to seek out the truth and to for justice to be served and not to just be delighted by the details.
mhm. Yeah,
And
because
yeah.
I feel like with almost every serial killer, like famous serial killer, like we're more our culture seems to be more obsessed with the killer than the people, the victims. Like, oh, how did they do it? And like you said, like they try to elevate these people as like they're criminal masterminds, and it's like, okay, they're not. They're not
To
Lex
me,
Luthor, okay? They're
yeah, they're not. To me, the simple answer is because we've portrayed them that way. In
yeah,
the same way that in this movie, it portrays the killers as not very intelligent and not very interesting, and therefore we end up rooting for the victims and their survival, and we care about them and connect with them. And when they turn around and turn the gun back on the killer and take them out, we're like, yeah, hell yeah, because the writer and director wanted us to do that. So I think, we do have a responsibility as a society, and I think creatives also have a responsibility too in how these stories get told, because you control the narrative, and what we want people to be interested in, they are interested in. I think people have been interested in these serial killers for so long because of how they've been portrayed. And
yeah.
so I think the movie's kind of touching on that, and it's really interesting. And yeah, it makes me view this movie differently than I did in the past. I kind of always was like, I'm not really into like slasher flicks. And now I'm like, oh, this is like an interesting and well done take on that.
Well, what's funny is, there were other movies before Halloween that can kind of count as kind of predate the slasher, Psycho, Peeping Tom, and especially Black Christmas. But
Hmm.
I think the success of Halloween, people took like the wrong things that worked in that movie. Like, because if you hear John Carpenter talk about it, he was like, I wasn't trying to make that. I wanted to just make a suspenseful movie about a killer stalking people. like like there are like all the touchstones and the tropes, but like really they just took what they liked and thought that's why Halloween was so successful, and kind of downgraded it to where it was nothing more than violence and nudity.
Yes. And I mean, I think that happens a lot, right? Somebody comes up with a groundbreaking idea and a new story, a new way of telling a story, or a new, effect, or a new plot point, or whatever, and people will like do it to death and not necessarily understand what was unique about it.
Yeah, I'm not
So,
throwing
yeah.
shade at Jason and Friday the 13th fans. Some of those movies are better than others.
I
uh,
agree. I
But
think those movies are entertaining.
let's be
And yeah.
honest, the original Friday the 13th is nothing more than like them copying pasting Halloween and changing it to summer camp and upping the violence and nudity. Like, it's
Right,
basically
right.
they're like, let's do that again, but with the stuff people want to watch, or what
And
they
in a
thought audiences. Well, I guess at the time they did, because those were hugely popular movies.
Right, and I think, like you said, I wouldn't come for any specific fans or anything like that, because at the end of the day, these are fictional stories, and I think every genre has its place. But I also agree with you that there are some films that were the groundbreaking blueprint, and then there are like endless copies, basically. So
And I
yeah.
think this one should be up there with the Halloween and the Nightmare on Elm Street, especially in the slasher genre, because it's another
Hmm.
one that kind of subverts and changes the what we expect in these type of movies. And yeah, we got a lot of knockoffs for a little while, the I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend, but that's
Yes,
that's the nature of the whatever is trending in horror. We're going to beat it to the ground till something new comes along.
definitely. I completely agree. Were there any other scenes or kills that you wanted to talk about?
I mean, I'm not really one that watches these movies for the kills. I mean, yeah, there's always creative and inventive ones, but it's
Yeah,
it's really the plot.
I
It's
agree.
it's really like that it's so self-referential, and I think that's what helped me as a little movie obsessed little child to get into these type of movies. And honestly, it's Kevin Williamson's screenplay. Like, I don't think he ever wrote anything as good as this. I know he was kind of on a trend there for a while in the 90s, and we recently covered The Faculty, which I do enjoy
That was
that for
pretty
what
good.
I enjoy that for what it is. I know it's not a great movie, but it's a fun little monster movie.
Yeah, I think
And
it's fun.
he did a Halloween sequel. Um, I guess his most other famous claim to fame is creating Dawson's Creek, which was I didn't really watch it, but I know it was huge for people my age when it was on the air. Like I remember kids talking about it and stuff, but
Yeah, I didn't really watch it either. I'll admit.
and it just showed you that with Wes Craven's direction that he was able to make another breaking film in the genre, even if he sometimes begrudgingly didn't want to come back and do it.
Yeah, he is just what he was good at, really.
A-
Yeah, I
And maybe
completely
that's
agree.
why he stayed on and directed all of the sequels except for the newest one because, we sadly lost him in 2015 because,
Yeah.
he kind of stepped away from the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels because he didn't really want to do more of those. And maybe that was like him wanting to stay in control of the franchise and it not getting out of hand or not doing what he felt like the Elm Street franchise went down.
Yeah, I could see that. Definitely. Yeah, I agree with you. I think this movie, the plot is what's interesting. And I think the concept, too, of like, I don't know that another slasher movie thought to or explored this idea that, like, if the killer picks, kind of a mask that's readily available that anyone can get, like, there's all those scenes in the school where, like, a bunch of people are wearing them, or like that's a way for people to be in two places at once, quote unquote, because two people can just wear the same costume. Like, I think it did some fun stuff with that, and that the nature of that is frightening too, I think, because then it's like our main character is like never safe because whether she's at school or at home or like anybody can have access to that costume and have one, everybody has a phone, like, all that stuff is kind of cool ideas, I think, in the movie.
Before we wrap it up, did you catch Wes Craven's little cameo in the movie?
No, what was it?
He's the janitor, and he's wearing the Freddy Krueger
Oh,
sweater and the
oh,
hat.
how funny.
And I think
That's
even
awesome.
Henry Winkler says "Sorry, Fred" or something like that.
Nice, nice. I did
So
not notice
just to
that.
make it even more meta, like we're even talking about his own movies.
Nick said that when Kevin Lillard dies, that's like one of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. A girl dies that way with like a TV landing on her.
Oh yeah, we just watched it last night. It's part 3.
Okay.
It's one of his I won't say the word because it's derogatory, but Freddy uses that word a lot,
Freddie
but
cusses a lot,
it's like
which is
welcome to
kind of
prime
funny.
time. It's like one of
Yeah,
his
that's what
most
Nick said. He was like, I wish he had said that again, but it's funny.
it's like one of his most famous one because that's kind of the one where he started becoming jokey Freddy. Like
Yeah.
I'm gonna make like he's in a
Scary Terry, like in Rick and Morty, like
yeah, well, that's totally because they keep using that
yeah.
word, like, they're making fun of that, but
It's
he
funny.
becomes like a '80s action star with his one-liners
Mhm.
where he kills you.
They're kind of enjoyable though.
Yeah, look, I think Dream Warriors rules, but, each sequel of that franchise kinda gets less and less interesting because they get more jokey. There's always, at least 1 or 2 creative kills in there.
Yeah.
And I won't fault anyone if they enjoy the whole franchise because, he is an interesting character, even though he's like the grossest person ever. But, that's what made that franchise different from the other films franchises of that genre because Freddy's also not like this soulless killing machine. He's
Yeah.
got a
That's true.
personality
That's
and
very true.
he's got a backstory. Like, it's not like he was just evil. Which, I mean, I love that about the first Halloween. Like, no explanation. He just murdering people and Donald Pleasance overacting to like 20 to everybody else. But but yeah, I think this is a brilliant movie. I think it's definitely of its time, but I think it reemerged not just horror but slasher genres because the slashers were done at this point. Like they had run their
Yeah, people are
course.
like tired of them, but this kind of refreshed it. I agree. What would you say like why do you kind of talked about that this whole time, but to sum it up, like why do you feel like you keep revisiting specifically this movie?
it's very weird, right? We always have certain movies that are like just logged in our brains. And sometimes I wonder if like the movies we see when are younger have a bigger impact on us. Like
Mhm.
for whatever reasons, like a lot of the movies I discovered between the ages of 11 and 14 have like sometimes the biggest impact on me are like ingrained
Yeah.
in my skull. And like this is one of the ones I can pinpoint. Like, would I say it's my favorite scary movie or even in my top 5 scary movies? Maybe not, but like those other movies I probably wouldn't like if I hadn't watched this one, because this is the one that opened the door for me. It was like my gateway drug to get into horror movies and
I
be
love
okay
that.
with them, because yeah, little 6th grade Cody before then was not having it. And he's like, "No." And this was like, "Oh, maybe these movies are fun and can be interesting to watch."
Yeah. Would that be your elevator pitch? It's
My
a gateway
elevator pitch
drug.
would be for this movies is, "Oh, you don't like scary movies, but maybe you want to try something that's not family friendly or comedy." Like, there those are those, and I'm seeing a lot more of those lists too now, like family friendly Halloween movies or Halloween movies to watch with the whole family, which I get, and there's nothing wrong. Some of those are fantastic and I love those movies, but like if you're wanting just a like an appetizer of spooky, you just want to
An app.
dip your toe in the spooky pool and see
I
if you
love
like it.
that.
Try Scream Out, cuz it's it's going to be spooky enough that you don't feel like you're watching a kids movie, but it's
Right.
got the humor and the self-referential um meta-ness to it that it'll keep you engaged, that like, oh yeah, this is a movie, I'm watching a movie, they're aware they're talking about, like they're aware they're in a movie, even though they're like it.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I
it-
totally agree with you. That's a really good way to put it. And Cody, before you go, where can people find you?
You can find me personally on Twitter and Letterboxd at FilmNerd85. If you are on Letterboxd, you can see the other 3 movies I pitched Lisa about talking about, because I listed them as my 4 favorites for spooky season. Um, we have a YouTube page and a Facebook page and a Twitter page. And like I said, we just talked about Nightmare on Elm Street and Hellraiser, and we're going to do Dream Warriors and Season of the Witch, because I personally think Season of the Witch rules and it's actually one of the better Halloween movies. And I like the David Gordon Green Halloween movies, but if they end it, which I don't think they will, but if they do, I would love to see them take the franchise with where they wanted to take it back when they did Season of the Witch.
That's awesome. Cool. Well, thank you again for coming on, and I know we'll be chatting about movies again soon, either on my show or on yours. So
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure. Thanks for being like, "Yeah, sure, come on," cuz I was like, I want to get on for spooky season and talk either a spooky or spooky themed movie. So, thank you for having me. I'm glad that you got to revisit this and enjoy it, because I do think it is one of the touchstone. It's definitely got to be up there for the 90s horror films
yeah,
for
yeah.
sure.